The Paternal Metaphor IV, Part 3 of 4. I am going to move on now to a new and different little schema, which has anyway already been introduced here, and which is going to show you what the consequences are going to be, at the same time as reminding you of what, in the last lesson, I tried to get you to have a feel of. We said that primordially we have the relationship between the infant and the mother. And it is true that it is along this line, I to M, that the first relationship to reality is constituted. I mean, this reality that is non-deductible, cannot be taken into account. And in experience can only be reconstructed with the help of a perpetual game of Find the Lady, if its constitution is made to depend uniquely on the desiring relationship of the infant with the object, insofar as it satisfies or does not satisfy his desire. If one can, at the very limits, find something that answers to this in a certain number of cases of precocious psychosis, it's always in the end to the so-called depressive phase of the infant's development that one leaves it every time, where one makes this dialectic intervene. In reality, what it is about, insofar as this dialectic carries with it an ulterior development that is infinitely more complex, of something completely different, i.e., that the relationship is not simply from the beginning about the infant's desire for the object that satisfies it or does not satisfy it, but, thanks to something that has a minimum of width, of unreality, that bestows the first symbolization, a landmark if you like, already triangular for the infant, not in relation to what is going to bring satisfaction to his need, but in relation to the maternal subject's desire that he sees in front of him. This is it, and uniquely insofar as something is already inaugurated in this dimension, represented here along the axis that is called the y-axis in maths, we have the dimension of the symbol. And as a result of this, it can be conceived that the infant, to the extent that he has to locate her himself in relation to these two poles, and by the way, it is very much around this that Mrs. Melanie Klein tentatively advances, without being able to formulate it. In effect, it revolves around the mother as a double pole. She calls it the good and bad mother. These two poles that the infant begins to take up his position. It is not the object that he positions, it's her himself that he positions to begin with. And so he is going to position her himself at all kinds of points in this way, to try to coincide with what is the mother's object of desire, to try him to respond to the mother's desire. This is the essential element, and this can go on for an extremely long time. There is, in truth, from this moment on, no space for any possible dialectic of need and satisfaction. It is here that, by necessity, we have to bring in the idea that it is completely impossible to consider the infant-mother relationship, to start with, because it is impossible to think of it and not deduce anything from it. But it is equally impossible, based on experience, to conceive of the infant as being in this ambiguous world that, for example, Kleinian analysts present to us, in which there is no reality other than that of the mother, and which allows them to say that the primitive world of the infant is at the same time totally dependent on this object and entirely autoerotic, insofar as the infant does not want to create any difference there, between an interior and an exterior for an object to which she-he is so tightly linked that she-he literally forms a closed circle with her. In fact, everyone knows, you only have to look at a lively little infant, that the little infant is not at all autoerotic, i.e. that she-he is interested like every little animal, and moreover a little animal that is more intelligent than the others, that she-he is interested in all sorts of other things in reality. Clearly not in any old thing, but there is one all the same to which we attach a certain importance and which, as the x-axis is here the axis of reality, presents itself right at the limit of this reality. This is not a fantasy, it's a perception. I will leave this, which is a huge issue in Kleinian theory, to one side. I mean that with her, for this is a woman genius, one can let anything go, but with her pupils, especially those informed by psychology as a subject, with someone like Suzanne Isaacs, who was a psychologist, this is unforgivable. Following Mrs. Melanie Klein, she has managed to get no further in articulating a theory of perception, to such an extent that there is no way of distinguishing a perception from an introjection in the analytic sense of the term. I can't highlight all the impasses in the Kleinian system in passing. I am trying to give you a model that will allow you to articulate more clearly what happens. What happens at the level of the mirror stage? It's that the mirror stage, i.e. the encounter between the subject and something that correctly speaking is a reality and at the same time is not one, i.e. a virtual image playing an absolutely decisive role in a certain crystallization of the subject that I call Urbild, and which is produced, I put it in parallel with the relationship that is produced between the infant and the mother. To put it bluntly, it is very much about this. The infant therein masters the fulcrum of this thing that presents itself to her/him by way of perception, if you like, at the limits of reality. What can otherwise be called an image, in the sense that this word has, insofar as the image has this property, in reality, of being a captivating signal that isolates in reality, that attracts on the side of the subject this capture of a certain libido, a certain instinct, thanks to which there are in effect a certain number of landmarks, perceptible points in the world, around which the living being more or less organizes his behavior. For the human being it would seem in the end that this here is the only landmark that subsists. It plays its role here, and it plays its role exactly insofar as it is correctly speaking alluring and illusory. It is in this way that it comes to the aid of an activity that, right from the beginning, is for the subject, insofar as he has to satisfy the desire of another, an activity that already puts itself forward as being directed towards creating the illusion of what the other desires. The infant, insofar as he is now going to constitute her himself, as all the jubilatory activity of the infant in front of the mirror is at the same time this moment here of his mastery of something that at the same time exists and does not exist, and in relation to which at the same time he locates his own movements, and also the image of those who are with him in front of the mirror. It's around this possibility that a certain privileged experience in reality is opened up for him, which has exactly this privileged position of being a virtual reality, unrealized and grasped as such, that the infant is going to be able to master something around which the whole possibility of human reality is literally going to be constructed. It is not yet that the phallus, insofar as this is the imaginary object with which the infant has to identify himself in order to satisfy the mother's desire, can right from the beginning be positioned in its place but the possibility of such a situation is greatly enriched by this crystallization of the ego within a certain landscape, one which opens up the possibility of the imaginary. And what, in the end, are we attending to? We are attending to something that is a double movement by which experience of reality has inserted, in the form of the image of the body, little I, an illusory and alluring element as fundamentally essential to the way that the subject locates her himself in relation to reality. And fully to this extent, to the extent of this space, of this margin that is offered to the infant by this experience, the possibility, in the opposite direction, for her his first ego identifications to enter into another field, which is defined as homologous and inverse to the one that is constituted by the triangle little m, little I, big M, which is this one here, the one between little m, little I and big E, which is the subject insofar as he has to identify, define, master, subjectivize her himself. And also the pole of the mother, big M, big E, little m. And what is this triangle here? And what is this field? And how is this trajectory that, from the start of the ego's Urbild, is going to allow the infant to master, to identify, to progress her himself? How can we define it? What constitutes it? It is, correctly speaking, constituted by this, that this ego Urbild, this first conquering or mastering of the self that the infant does in her his experience, from the moment that he has doubled the real pole in relation to which he has to position her himself, to make her himself fit into this trapezium, big E, little m, little I, big M, insofar as he identifies her himself with these multiple signifying elements in reality, I mean, when throughout these successive identifications he is her himself, he takes on the function her himself, the role of a series of signifiers, hieroglyphs if you like, of a type, a form and a form of presentation that is going to punctuate her his reality with a certain number of landmarks that make up, right from the beginning, a reality stuffed with signifiers. To put it in other terms, what is going to constitute the limit here is this formation that is called the ego ideal. You are going to see why it is important that I position it like this for you. Meaning that what the subject identifies her himself with by going in the symbolic direction, leaving the imaginary landmark behind, and in some way her himself instinctively ready-made by her himself from her his own body, and insofar as it is going to engage her him in a series of signifying identifications in the direction defined as such, as opposed to the imaginary, i.e. by using the imaginary as a signifier, and the form of identification that is called the ego ideal is made at the paternal level. Why? Precisely in that at the paternal level there is a greater detachment in relation to the imaginary relationship than at the level of the relationship with the mother. This little edification of schemas, stacked one on top of the other, these little leapfrogging dancers, with the legs of one on top of the shoulders of the other, this is exactly what it's about. It's insofar as the third of these little layers of scaffolding, i.e. the father insofar as he intervenes to prohibit, meaning in order to make what is precisely the mother's object of desire pass on up to the correctly speaking symbolic rung, i.e. that it is not just an imaginary object, but it is also destroyed, forbidden. It is insofar as he intervenes as a real character, as I, to play this role, that this I is going to become something eminently signifying and allowed to be the hub of identification in the final analysis. The ultimate result of the Oedipus complex that means that the formation called the ego ideal relates to the father. And these things that oppose the ego ideal in relation to the mother's object of desire are illustrated on the schema in this way. That if the virtual identification and phallic subject ideal, insofar as it is the mother's object of desire, is positioned there, at the apex of the first triangle of the relationship with the mother, it is positioned there as virtual, being both always possible and always under threat. So under threat that it has to be destroyed at a certain moment by the intervention of the pure symbolic principle represented by the name of the Father, which is there in a state of veiled presence, but a presence that unveils itself, and not progressively, unveils itself via an intervention that is initially decisive, in that it is the prohibiting element, and that precisely this space created by the subject's tentative searching that has had to take the lead, and that does lead in certain cases to this exclusive relationship of the subject with the mother, not to a pure and simple dependence, but to this something that manifests itself in all kinds of perversions through a certain essential relation to the phallus, one in which the subject takes it on in various forms. Either he makes it into his fetish, or that we are here at the level of what can be called the primitive root of the perverse relationship with the mother. It is insofar as, in this identification starting from the ego, the subject, who can in effect at a certain stage begin to approach an identification between her, his ego, and the phallus, is essentially carried in the other direction, meaning one in which he constitutes a certain relation that is marked by the endpoints that are illustrated there in a certain relation with the image of her, his own body, meaning with the imaginary pure and simple, i.e. the mother. On the other hand, as a real term, her, his ego, insofar as it is susceptible, not simply to recognizing itself, but to being recognized, of making itself into a signifying element, and no longer simply an imaginary element in her, his relationship with the mother, these successive identifications can be produced which Freud, in his theory of the ego, articulates in the most firm way. This is the object of his theory of the ego. It's in order to show us that the ego is made up of a series of identifications, refer to the schema, a series of identifications to an object that is beyond the immediate object, which is the father insofar as he is beyond the mother.